Hello, and welcome to today's presentation, Mastering Indirect Spend, 5 Keys to Success, brought to you by Institute for Supply Management and sponsored by Zycus. I'm your moderator, John Yuva. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to direct your attention to your audience console, where you'll find multiple application widgets for your convenience. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget to submit your question. We will try to answer questions during the webcast, but if we run out of time or if further dialogue is needed, questions will be addressed via email following the presentation. If you would like a copy of today's slide deck, it is available in the Resource List widget at the bottom of your screen. I would now like to introduce today's presenter. Bill Michaels is CEO at Aeropart Consulting, helping companies transform business strategies into maximum profits. He is a leading expert in purchasing and supply chain management. Bill's consulting work has led him to some of the world's greatest companies across a wide spectrum of industries and countries, transforming procurement and the supply chain. Well known in the purchasing and operations management community, as well as the food and pharmaceutical industries, Bill is a sought-after speaker and writer with many publications, including co-authorship of the book Transform Your Supply Chain. He is now working on a new book focused in the area of supplier relationship management. During today's presentation, Bill will discuss effectively increasing spend under management, resulting in curbing maverick spend, ensuring higher compliance, increased productivity, and improved bottom-line savings, and the 5 most important keys to successful indirect category management. With that, I'll turn it over to Bill.
Thanks, John. It's really a great pleasure for me to speak about mastering indirect procurement. I've worked on these categories for a long time, and for a lot of reasons, I'm excited about it. One, it takes a different skill set to do it. The second is the spend's not always understood by management leaders or company leaders. And the third thing is that there's very, very high opportunities, and so is the resistance to change. In this, we'll talk a little bit about the complexities of with indirect materials. We'll talk about how do you establish a project governance, which is something I will do every time I have to work on indirect with a company. How do we engage the stakeholders? How do we get them engaged? How do we lower that resistance to change? How do we sell the value of procurement to our stakeholders? And what are the 5 keys to really managing successfully indirect procurement? I want to start with looking at procurement industry changes over time. I like to look at this chart, and I do it a lot. In the 1990s, it was all about finding the price. Prior to that, it was all about getting the supply. And around 1995, we started getting into cost management. About 2000, we really started to look at, we understand now the material, the labor, the overhead. Now we want to develop strategies and strategic sourcing and build the strategic sourcing, moving on to category management, which most companies are involved in deeply. And as we move forward to 2020, we're going to see value management, and that's going to become more and more important as we look at indirect spend. A lot of times the companies really didn't have the processes, nor did they have the capability to dig into the spend. In fact, one of my first areas looking into the spend at indirect was in a pharmaceutical company, and there are very few companies that had spend analysis tools, and I had to go through line by line through the general ledger to find all of the spend in a $15 billion company, which took a long time, was a lot of work. So now with those tools, we can really focus on indirect spend. All right, so as we think about the indirect spend area, we have to think about what are some of the complexities. Well, when we look at indirect, it can run the gamut from, finding MRO materials to safety supplies to real estate to legal services, and it's a very, very diverse expenditure. So trying to figure out what areas to tackle, how do you tackle it, how do you work with stakeholders who have some expertise, and how do you manage those stakeholders? This is a critical piece of indirect. In direct materials, it's kind of easy to see that if procurement and engineering want to get together and make a change, it's pretty easy. They get together, they work together, they do the testing, and they make the change. But when it comes to indirect, the stakeholders own the spend. So the stakeholders really own the budgets, own the spend, and the buying job becomes influencing the stakeholders and using leadership to actually consolidate and generate savings and opportunities from the spend. What the purchasing folks and the buyers own is they own the process. And I think this will become a little bit more important as I talk about some of the case studies that I've seen and how you can own the process and influence the spend. So we'll talk about how to do that. And I think that in the indirect spend area, there's a couple skill sets you have to have. One is influence, and the second is leadership. And it's very difficult if you can't influence the stakeholders, or if you don't have the leadership skills to drive the changes across the company, build the processes, you're going to have difficulty in this area. So with direct materials, sourcing owns the expenditure, and indirect and stakeholders own the budget, and consequently it's a more difficult buying job. So when we start looking at this, many companies don't know where to start when they start looking at the spend. Typically it's unclassified, it's random, it's unrecorded, it could come from multiple places, and it's difficult to find. So that, I think, is one of the complexities. Another one is data. I mean, there's a lack of coding, sporadic buying, general funds, limited categorization, expensed items. And the lack of coding is kind of interesting because I worked with a mining company once, and they decided they were going to let any stakeholder in the company add item codes for the indirect spend. And one of the funniest ones I saw was a grease gun like Joe's, and they were proliferating the categories at $1,900 a week until they finally put controls on the process. So they can come from anywhere, but again, it has to be categorized. We have to be able to see it. We have to understand it, and we have to sort of have some kind of coding system to manage it. Then when we look at stakeholders, there's a large number of individuals dispersed across the organization and different interests in different projects. So we will talk about how to really identify what are the right projects and how do we work to understand and get control of the maverick spending and the business. And then the last thing is there's no metrics. There's multiple systems in many companies. When we get to indirect, I went to one company that had 26 different systems. There's no rules, and then stakeholders are really people with good intentions trying to get a job done, but they don't necessarily focus on the cost and value piece as well as getting the job done. So one of the more difficult things that happens when I go into companies and I look at the indirect spend is the thing that I call cost savings vaporizing, right? Cost savings vaporizing. And what happens is when you have no formal process to manage the savings, they return to the stakeholders and they're spent. So I've gone to several companies where the CFOs have said to me, my procurement department says they've saved $10 million. I can't find it in the P&L. And it's pretty easy to understand what happens. So if I go to a maintenance manager and I save him $1 million in his maintenance budget, it gives him the opportunity to do $1 million more in maintenance. If I go to a travel manager and we take the travel costs down by a couple $2 million, people do more traveling because they can with their budgets. So procurement loses credibility, and I think this is a big problem in the indirect spend area. One of the things that I always do when I'm working on indirect with a company is I align with the CFO and the business management, and I say, you have to make a decision on every savings we get. So on travel, they may decide to take it and put it in P&L, whereas in marketing, they may want to do more marketing with the money. But that's a business decision. Ours is to generate the opportunities for the company. The business has to decide whether to take it into the P&L or whether to take it and spend it. So that's a critical piece. If you don't do that, you won't find the savings, the company will be disenchanted, and procurement loses a lot of credibility. So that's one of the things that I would recommend right away, that if you're not doing that, you got to have a top management decision. And we'll talk more about governance, but that's a key one. Stakeholders, purchasing is often viewed by stakeholders as the evil empire. They're the people that are the policy police. They're driving compliance, interrupting relationships, uncovering inefficiencies, and from that point of view, a slowdown in the entire process. So I can't get my job done. So I think that the key is we have to add value. We have to demonstrate we have to add value, and we have to make sure that when we start to attack categories, we include everybody. So we have to have a team-driven product that includes all of the stakeholders and keeps the stakeholders in the business, and we have to have communication processes that work with management. Otherwise, we will pretty much have stakeholder resistance and under-optimize the opportunity that we can get with expenditures. I often wonder, why are stakeholders reluctant to embrace projects? And I've come up with, at least building this presentation, a couple of reasons that I've seen as I approach indirect in different companies. First one is, and I'll show you two case studies after this, but they fear that you might find large cost reductions, that they may not have been optimizing the spend. They may even know that. They also may have personal and business relationships with suppliers over a long period of time, and they now know that a process where we're putting everybody on an even keel, and we're driving maybe RFPs, RFQs, and auctions on leverageable spend will interrupt those relationships. You may even find a stakeholder that has built a process over the years and is married to the process and doesn't want to see anybody interrupt it. They may feel that they're going to have a loss of freedom and no opportunity to work on the item, which is nothing could be farther from the truth if you do a indirect project right. And the other thing they fear is that you might slow down projects. You could possibly slow them down, be the cog in the wheel, and impact their performance. So those are some of the reasons. And the other thing that's really interesting is finding out who a stakeholder is. So I've got two case studies here. I did a project in a pharmaceutical company, and it was very, very odd to me that the chief operator is a $15 billion company, and it was odd to me that the COO and chairman of the board wanted to be on the office supply team. Lots of stakeholder resistance, although we did include top management. They had one supplier for a number of years. Lots of resistance. The supplier caused a problem, said that he wasn't treated fairly in the past. So we did a reverse auction on $2.2 million in office supplies and saved $1.1 million. So there was a lot of embarrassment, and those two senior managers were the one that selected a supplier who was a longtime friend. Went to another business, and we looked at uniforms. There's a lot of stakeholder resistance, and you would think, okay, there's 5 companies, uniforms are leverageable, and as long as you get the business needs correct, you should be able to manage a project like that. When we dug into it, they had a 10-year contract. They were spending $1 million a year. It was take or pay, so if they canceled the contract, they had to pay the balance off. And when we did the RFX, the true cost was $250,000 a year from the top 3 suppliers. So management was involved in the additional decision. Here's a case where they were kind of embarrassed by the results. So you have to be careful about stakeholders. So what's important? I think when I'm approaching a indirect assignment, there's a couple things that are really important. I want a governance put in place, and I'll explain that in another slide, but I really want a governance. So I won't really start a program unless I can get some governance, some project governance. I want stakeholder engagement, and I want everybody included in the process. I definitely will build a team charter, and I'll explain what that is, because that will help you clarify and engage stakeholders right from the start. And then I want to have milestones and reporting. So For me as a consultant, when I go in, I want a steering committee for Indirect, and I want some of the senior leadership on that steering committee. I want them and the business to help us pick who's going to be engaged in each of the projects, and I want them to endorse the project. Then I want a team charter, which is going to outline the mission, goals, and responsibilities. And then I want to return to that steering committee with the progress that we're making. So that's the kind of thing that I like to see. All right, so the steering committee, it can be senior leaders. The best one I ever had was a company in the food business where the CEO led the steering committee and each of the division presidents were on it. The projects came forward, they approved the projects, and each one was committed as a champion. Right? Also, project leader is important. Picking a project leader and understanding who it is, and it's not always a procurement leader. It can be a stakeholder leader. As long as we can manage the process. And then I want a good, balanced project team, and some people that are very in favor and some people that are opposed, but I think that's going to create a lot of dynamics. And I want, all the stakeholders involved in the was very, very successful for me, was a company that had a consumer product, and it was actually a pharmaceutical over-the-counter project that lost their patent, and I was actually the facilitator for the team, and it was a $25 million spend, and when we got into the spend, we found out that there was a lot of problems there were 3 different ways to use it. There were 3 different applicators. They were overfilling the product because the bottle was too big. They were hand stuffing the packaging. We put that team together. Again, this was a reduction of 50%. Now, the team thought my role was to outsource it, and they dug in and found ways to make it, find it, deliver it better, cheaper, and faster. So at the end of the day, the company was the winner, and the team was aligned. So I think, having a governance like this is really good. In fact, as a consultant, when I go in, I'll set up the steering committee. We'll do some training with each of the teams for probably about 2 or 3 days. Strategies. We'll look at what data do we have, what data don't we have. We'll collect the data we don't have, but we'll also look at what's the opportunity. And by the end of the first week, we'll go in front of the steering committee and say, here's the plan, here's what we think we know, here's what we still need to know, here's the strategy, here's what we're going to deliver. And then we give the team 8 weeks to do it. I don't think it should take more than 8 weeks for a team to get it all together, work together, and deliver a project, at least a project strategy that can be implemented. And then they go back. And what that does for me is people that are in the on the project team are very reluctant to go in front of senior management and say, we're not able to do it. They won't do it. They'll find a way to do it. And that kind of helps engagement, and that's why I like to see a governance structure. All right, so it can be, I like to have senior business executives, or at least leaders from the category that we're going to have. I like to have a finance person that sees what's happening, can help us with what happens in the savings. I want people that have high interest and power to champion the project. They don't have to be on the team, but I like them as champions. And again, I want the senior stakeholders to be involved in the team as well. So those are the kinds of people that I like to get into the governance process. All right, the role of the steering group is kind of, I want them to approve the projects, all right, agree with the projects, look at the strategy, create the timeline, and their job is really their responsibility, authority, and accountability to move all of the roadblocks out of the way. The project leader, he or she has to assemble the team, provide process, make sure that we have the right process in place, make sure the team has all the tools it needs to drive forward and achieve results, build a communication strategy so that we're communicating to all different levels of the company, and build a charter. The team has to work together. All right, they really have to get the data they need so that we have fact-based priorities and we know what we're doing, and we have to deliver the results quickly. Because if you don't manage the time constraints on a team can go on forever and ever and ever and have a lot of disputes and a lot of problems. So I like to always time-bound the team. I like 8 weeks, it can go to 12 weeks, depending upon the complexity of the project. But at the end of the day, there's a deadline where they have to be done and a governance that they have to report to. Now, that will always make your indirect project do a lot better than if it's just kind of done from a purchasing standpoint, driving it through the organization and through all the resistance. It's not going to be as easy. It can be done, but it's not going to be as easy. And then when we look at the stakeholders, we want those stakeholders we need to have stakeholders and make sure that they capture all the business needs. And the business needs are so important because that's what will make your project fail. So I mentioned earlier an office supply project. And when we looked at the business needs, well, some stakeholders wanted desktop delivery. Other stakeholders wanted us to have the supplier put an inventory in and do vendor managed inventory. And each location was different. Now, your project will fail if you do not collect all of the business needs, get them identified, and then find the right suppliers that can meet every need. And that will make the project go so much easier. And that may be a reason why some of the projects that I've seen are not always so successful. So I like to have, again, this governance structure in place. What do we need to know about stakeholders? Well, we want to know who they are. There may be stakeholders that we don't even know. It may be someone that invented the process years ago. Want to know where they report. Have they worked in the past in a collaborative way? What's their function? What behavior do they have? What motivates them? How much power do they have in the organization? I'm going to show you a power interest matrix later in this workshop that will help us map and identify the stakeholders. What's their attitude toward procurement? What's their attitude toward your project? Are they collaborative or are they going to continue to be maverick? And we'll talk about how to map these stakeholders out, what to do with them, but we need to know as much as we can about those stakeholders. Okay, and then when we build teams, we want to make sure we have effective teams. They can be global, regional, or local teams. I don't like to have more than 5 or 6 people in a team. So what I would do if I had a global project, or what I do when I have a global project, is I create regional representatives and then make sure that I communicate to all the stakeholders that set roles and responsibilities and accountabilities, probably conference calls once a week, depending upon what the project is and how complex it is. Maybe if they need to come together again, we'll do that. But one of the important things about the teams that I've found is that I always like to establish a budget for the project. And if you're dealing with global teams or if you're dealing with multiple manufacturing operations, the point comes up, who's going to pay for all this? Who's going to pay for the travel? Who's going to take their responsibility when they're out? I think one of the things we want to do is make sure we have a budget so we eliminate all those objections. And we can do it through our estimate of the savings when we initially put the project together. So we'll look at what we think the opportunity is and then what's the cost of running the team and driving the project. I think if you don't do that, you wind up with teams of stakeholders that don't want to participate, don't have a stake in the game, can find an objection for not being in the program. So I think I like to see a budget established when I'm building teams. If that's beyond the capability, I think we need to make sure then that our senior management makes sure that when a person's committed to the team, that their leadership agrees 100% to fully participate. So if you can't get the budget, you need to make sure you get the commitment. Now, I talked about a team charter, and what this is really a document that really says, here's what our mission and goals are, here's what the category is, Here's who's going to sponsor the team, who's going to lead the team, what are all the member responsibilities, what's the targets and the constraints and the budgets that we're going to use. So I like to have this document put together, and we like to use this document to drive those projects. And I think that is always gets you back in line, because if anybody falls off the team, we can go back to the category, mission, and goals. We got a sponsor who said it's their responsibility to keep things together. And the charter just kind of keeps everything grounded, everything focused, everybody on a mission. And if you haven't done that in the past, it would be my recommendation that you think about building a team charter. So the process, it could be, we could do a lot of things. It could be consumption reduction. I worked in one company where they started to look at the number of different inks they were using for printers. And that was pretty interesting, but the other thing was they put high-speed printers in every department. So, what they decided was, okay, everybody's got a printer in their office, it's going. And the VP of purchasing, it was a company-sponsored project. The complexity and the money that could be saved by the high-speed printers in every department was great. And so they had to go around and collect everybody's printer off of their desk. But they stopped using, I want to say at this time, was somewhere around $6 million worth of ink, right? 6 or 7. Standardized specs. I've seen, 16 or 17 different uniforms around the world in a mining company, and there was no opportunity to consolidate them. And that was as much as, I think it was at least $2 million a month that they were spending in uniforms, just reusing and getting people and reuniforming people, new employees. Reuse, so condition and refurbish office furniture. I've seen that done where a company has the capability to refurbish it all, reupholster it, put new stuff in, and bring it back. So, consumption reduction is an opportunity. And then to consolidate as much as you can on specs and reduce complexity with limited choice. Do we need 9 different yellow tablets for office supplies, or do we need 15 different pens? And I think it's getting the business aligned to these consumption reduction opportunities could be a useful tool. Another one is the market opportunities, where we consolidate expenditure, we maximize the leverage tools that we have using, RFX, auctions, we do compliance monitoring, and we kind of rationalize the supply base. It's not uncommon in Indirect to find, especially a company that's had acquisitions, a huge supply base. In fact, one of the companies I went to in the food industry had 365,000 suppliers, and it was huge. So the opportunity to be able to look at that, identify what to do, who's the best suppliers in the industry, how do we get the stakeholders aligned. And one of the things I like to do is I take a category, and before we even do anything with the category, I go through, let's forget our current suppliers and new suppliers and everybody else. What is the best attributes of this supplier? If we could have everything we wanted, what would we be? Right? And then when I actually and now introduce the suppliers and match them against the criteria that the stakeholders first identified, it's not uncommon for their supplier not to be able to meet those criteria. And other suppliers may meet some more or some less, but what it does is it takes all the emotion out of the supplier relationship process. All right, so if we talked about why stakeholders resist, interruption of long-term relationships, they may be committed to a process, they're embarrassed that that they've done poor sourcing, they won't be involved in the process anymore, the stakeholders may be influenced by power loss, they may feel that without having the expenditure, they don't get lunches anymore, or other perceived benefits they have, or their personal relationships or long-term relationships get interrupted. So we have to think about, what is the resistance? Where is it coming from? What are the criteria that's driving that resistance as we start to think about stakeholders? All right, so when I think about stakeholders, I really want to do a couple things with them. I want to identify them. I want to map who they are and what their interests and issues and power is. I want to profile them. How aligned are they to the key objectives? And I want to engage them and build a strong business relationship with them that helps the stakeholders through. So those are some of the things. How do you get their support? well, we got to identify all the needs. And I talked about how important business needs were. We have to motivate them to work on the process. We have to really understand what any of the issues are. What's the current performance and how well do they play on teams? I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at them. Now, this is a chart that I borrowed from my previous company, ADR, so I want to give them credit for it. But it really says, where should you, if we were looking at a process and you had the business needs analysis, and then you had a current state analysis, and then you had a sourcing strategy, and then you actually decided on a bidding process, and then you created a sourcing place, there's key places where stakeholders have to be engaged. They have to be engaged in the business needs analysis. They have to be engaged when you're developing a strategy. You may want their engagement as you're doing the event or bidding process or whatever event you're doing. And then certainly you want them engaged when the right recommendation's made. Now the interesting thing is who owns the supplier relationship. And I think when you think about indirect spend, both people own the relationship. I think procurement owns the commercial relationship, and the stakeholder has to own the business relationship. So I think it's really got to be clear in your mind that your role is making the commercial relationship great, but at the end of the day, the stakeholder really needs to run the business relationship and performance metrics on the supplier. So there's lots of places where the stakeholders can be engaged. All right, so here are some potential stakeholder groups. Budget holders, the users, technical experts, specification owners, could be sales, could be management, could be anywhere. And the external stakeholders we have are the suppliers, the regulatory bodies, trade organizations, government sponsors or government regulation people, all could be stakeholders. Right? So stakeholders have a big influence on the project. Someone you have to influence to let you apply your practice and expertise on their project. And it's not uncommon for a group of R&D PhD scientists in a pharma company or a biotech company to feel that you may not have that skill set. Sometimes you see it in marketing or legal. So we have to actually help them understand that we own the process, they can do it. In fact, in one of the assignments I had, we had identified the opportunities across it. The CFO said, I want to capture those opportunities, and IT said, we don't want to play. We're not going to play. And so we said, okay, IT, here's the process you have to follow. Here's all the steps. Here's the process. You're on your own, and here is your target, right? At the end of the day, when we had with the governance meetings, the IT guys had to come in and show that they used the process, and they had to show that they were hitting the target. Well, it didn't take more than the first round of projects for them to say they didn't want any more involvement. They wanted an IT procurement professional to come in and do the projects in the future. So it all depends on what it is. I mean, the stakeholder map helps you group the stakeholders together so you can start thinking about it. And it's pretty important with a large program, and you have lots and lots of people. So I think the exercise of identifying and listing the stakeholders is going to be quite a journey when you start a big project. I like this map. The map says how much interest does the stakeholder have and how much influence and power in your project. So if they have low influence and power and they don't have a lot of interest, you don't really have to spend a lot of time in engaging them and driving them. All you have to do is a minimum communication. Whereas if we have a person with high interest and high power and low interest, we may have to just keep them satisfied, make sure they know what's going on with the project. If we have a person that has high interest and high power, we need to manage them closely, make sure they're getting the communication, make sure that they're helping us drive that program. And then these people are really valuable, where they may not have the influence of power, but they really have a high interest in the project, and they can engage other stakeholders and get them aligned in the project as well. So I think that's a really good opportunity. So, it makes it easier if you map the stakeholders. It makes you think about how to manage each stakeholder, and it helps you get on the right foot in managing them. So at the end of this section, we want to make sure we understand all the stakeholders' needs, wishes, wants, capabilities. We want to make sure that all the messages are built for the individuals and the teams. we want to work with the team to build a charter so we all agree on what the mission, role, and objectives of the team is. We want to define in that charter the roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities. We want to have a really good project plan, and if you're really smart, you'll have a governance structure that'll support the project, and you'll find supporters and team champions through your stakeholder mapping that'll help you drive the changes through. Okay, from there we're going to go to identifying all the stakeholders on a map, making sure that we understand their informational needs, making sure that we find the best way to communicate. You know, we have 4 different generations in the workshop, in the workforce, so we really have to be careful about how we do it. And if we're a distributed group, we got to make sure that we have the best method to communicate and understand how people are communicating. In fact, we did an indirect project in a bakery once, and they have a newsletter called The Dough is Rising. And for every project that the team worked on, the teams were getting recognized. And as they got recognized, not only in the business, but they got a small little gift, more and more people wanted to join teams. They had more people wanting to join the teams because it became a company culture to drive that spend to a different level. And that was in both the direct and indirect side. How often do you communicate? You don't want to communicate too much. And then who's going to communicate and how we're going to do about it? How are we going to do it? We need to think about all these things well ahead of time so we know it. I started to look at why do the projects fail? Well, they fail because you have a lack of leadership. No governance structure is like running a snowball up a hill or running a big rock up a hill. It's not going to work. Management doesn't buy into the project. If management doesn't buy in, you can't expect the stakeholders to buy in. If you don't have a management commitment, the stakeholders won't buy in as well. Lack of knowledge, if we don't have enough knowledge, if we don't collect the right data, if we can't build a fact-based argument, we're not going to be able to be successful. If we don't collect input from everybody and don't correctly get the business needs, guaranteed failure. If you don't have a really good process, failure. If you can't overcome resistance to change, you're going to fail. If we don't have a focus, which is why I try to get the charter in place, it'll fail. If you don't have the influence, if you can't influence others, not going to be good. If you don't have a champion that's going to help you with the project, you're not going to be successful. And again, if you don't have a plan and fact-based data, don't expect a lot of success. I think it's one of the things is you got to sell procurement's value in sourcing. And how do you do that? How do you sell procurement's value in sourcing? Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is, one, we can define value, but the other thing is that we have the commercial expertise, and we want to make sure that we show what value we can add. Stakeholders will resist if they think you're only using cost reduction. In fact, I never use the word cost reduction when I'm talking about projects and indirect. I always use the words cost and value improvement. And value can be speed to market, innovation, additional products and services, can be competitive advantage of some kind, improved supplier commitment, maybe integrating the supply chain, but they want to see that you're going to bring them additional value. If they think you're only price-based and only cost reduction-based, and that's how you're measured, then you're going to have resistance that's going to be hard to overcome. So I think you need to start thinking about selling the notion of value. Speed to market is a really good one, and understanding how you can engage the stakeholders. And one of the other things I have to be honest with you about is I never really worry about who's getting the credit. At the end of the day, if the spend goes down, procurement's going to get the credit. So if we let the leaders of the team or the team itself take all this credit, that's great. If if you can get the company to incentivize them on their team performance, that's great too. But I want to make sure that the team gets credit for what they do and that we're driving these projects successfully. I mean, you got to have vision and direction. We got to be able to understand value creation. What we do has to generate revenue. These are all things that we have to do for leadership. And really, your future, your skills, is going to depend on how collaboratively you can work, internally or externally. And if we can get the teams reporting to a higher level, that's great. Right? So some of the key factors is, you got to drive innovation, value, opportunity. You got to build sustainable internal and external relationships. You got to create business and financial fact-based solutions. You got to make sure that you have the vision, direction to drive change, and you got to, over time, get organizational respect. So, when I actually start these projects, I look for what's the easy wins. I don't want to fight the difficult battle, even though easy wins. And I'll get a series of easy wins. I'll get another series of easy wins, and all of a sudden, the management of the company and the stakeholders will start seeing these wins, and they'll want to do it. So if a group like IT or a group like another group is very resistant to your change and your influence into the procurement side, I'd pick areas where we're going to win. And one of the projects I did, we did eight teams, and we reduced the product cost significantly through those teams. And we picked easy wins. We picked the ones that were really easy. Behind them, we put the more strategic, difficult projects. And by the time it got to the more difficult projects, it was we had already had a group of successes that the management hung their hats on, and it made the resistance go away. In fact, some of the people that were resistant to change in the higher level projects actually were moved to different positions or moved completely. All right, so what do you have to do? Well, you have to build a governance process first and define quick wins, quick win projects. Build off of your quick wins, as I just said, and embed yourself with stakeholders. Sometimes you want to even actually live with them, be part of their budget processes and everything else. And by year 3, you want to be considered a trusted advisor in the process and you're integral part of the team with the stakeholders. It doesn't happen overnight. It's going to happen over a longer period of time. What you've been waiting for. 5 keys to success. Capture the business needs. Capture all the business needs to make sure you have it. Create some kind of governance for your project. Agree what the plan is for savings. Make sure you have a clear project map and stakeholder map, and make sure you communicate. In indirect spend, you cannot communicate enough. So with that, I think I've got a little bit of time for questions. Hello?
Hi there, Bill. We actually have received several questions. One is a few people have asked what RAA stands for. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. When I think about RAA, I'm thinking about responsibility, authority, and accountability. So I want to make sure that we understand what the responsibilities of the team or the individuals are. We want to make sure that they have the right authority to do the job, and then we want to make sure that they're held accountable for doing it. So whenever I'm speaking about RAA, I'm always talking about responsibility, accountability, and authority. And sometimes I'll even add a second R in there and call it roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, and authority.
Great, that makes sense. Also, when initiating a program for indirect expenditure, what is a good place to start?
Well, I like to start with some kind of opportunity analysis. So look at where is the spend disaggregated. If you've got a spend analysis or if you don't have a spend analysis, I guess that's the best place to start, is to identify where is all the spend and how does it categorize together. And then once you start with that level of spend, you have to look at how much opportunity is there. So if we have what we think is a spend of maybe, in an IT group, maybe $50 million or $30 million or even $5 million, we'd want to look at that, and then we'd want to look at, is there an opportunity that we can influence it? We may have another area that might be easier to deal with, like cafeterias or even janitorial services or office supplies. When you deliver, like we did, $1.1 million in savings on something like office supplies, it becomes very easy. But what we were going to manage it, what was going to be the strategy, we executed it. So I think it starts with the spend analysis and categorization. So you got to know where is all the spend and what are the likely pockets of opportunity. And then when I look at those, I like to look at which are the ones that I can quickly influence and have a quick win on. So if you think about office supplies, does anybody really care where their white or yellow pads come from? Not really, but we can create a specification, we can drive that specification, and we can create a market basket that everybody agrees on, and then we can go after that spend. So I think you have to look at the categorization, do an expenditure analysis, know where the spend is, and then start to pick out which are going to be the quick wins and easy wins to start a program. And then from there, once you get the quick wins, it's easier to start selling on bigger projects.
Very interesting. And also, can you elaborate on what a team charter is and when it is a good idea?
Well, whenever I have a project team together working on a strategy, the first thing I want to do is I want to create what is our mission, what is our vision, what are we targeting, what are going to be the roles of the leader, the team members, and the other stakeholders, and then I want everybody to agree on that to begin with. Once we get agreement on a charter, then it's pretty easy because we now all are aligned on a mission. We're all agreed that that's the way we're going to go. Sometimes the charter discussion is a very difficult task because people have different ideas. But once we consolidate it as a team, we really now say, here's the mission, here's the vision, here's the values, here's what our strategy are, here's what we're hoping to achieve by this thing, and here's how we're going to work together, and here's how we're going to communicate. Once we get that, I like that right at the beginning. When the first thing I do with a team is create a charter, and then management buys off on it. They look at it, they agree, and we're off and running, and everybody's kind of committed to the same goal.
Bill, another question is, what is a great way to keep the stakeholders involved or to bring them back into the fold?
Well, I mean, one of the key things, one of the things I like to do is there's a couple things. I like to communicate. We like to have a general communication about the success. And I mentioned in the presentation that we had a bakery that created this newsletter, the Vaporize. I also like to reward success. So as part of the team process, one stakeholder process, if we have a lot of success, one, the team gets a lot of credit. But secondly, we recognize that they spent time, additional time off of their job, working on this project, helping the company. In fact, John, is really interesting because I had one CEO, and his company on a very low margin business saved $40 million. And I said to him, I said, you got to do something. He said, what? I said, well, I don't know, but you got to recognize him. And what he decided to do was he had a special night for all the teams and team members. And they had the best restaurant in the city. He picked them all up in limos with their spouses. They had this huge event, and they still, to this day, that was 7 years later, they still remember it. So I think you have to recognize the success. You have to publish success. You have to reward success. And I think that, if you do that right and you have the communications right, the stakeholders will want to be engaged, especially if they're successful and they've had a big win. So now they have more money in their budget. I think the one thing that hurts it is if the business decides to take the money out of the budget. That's one thing that could be a problem, but it's not the procurement trying to do it. It's agreed with the business, and the business is making decisions on the money.
Great. Another question asks, what are your suggestions for working with stakeholders when they've already determined suppliers for a job prior to including indirect buyers?
That's a difficult one. It's doing just what I said in terms of identifying, okay, what would be the ideal supplier? Let's take all the names out. What are we looking to achieve through this, and what kind of supplier would be ideal? So I've done that with marketing folks, and the less out of pocket, the more involvement, higher level people on the jobs. So we get that all laid out, and then we convince them to work in a process where we can add other suppliers, map them out, and then see how do they all fall out about the criteria. If you can't do that, you take their supplier against the ideal criteria, and their supplier won't be able to deliver all of those things. So there's two things that you have to do. You either have to work with them, to get those suppliers up to the performance levels that they identified as the ideal supplier, or you have to convince them to let other people come in and then match everybody against that criteria, and that takes the emotion out. But if they're committed to a supplier, at some point you're going to have to work with them. But you could put performance metrics in too. I mean, one of the things you might do is say, okay, we'll work with your supplier, but let's identify what's a high level of performance. Right? So then we identify the high levels of performance. You may not be able to do it right away. You may give in to that supplier, but put a performance program together. And as they measure that performance to see that supplier's performance, they may change their view on the supplier for the next time you come together. So you might be able to do it, or you might not.
Okay. When starting from ground zero, would it make sense to focus on stakeholder group only, or obtain small wins to build your reputation, which can then assist with additional opportunities later on?
I'm an advocate of doing the small wins, but you got to look at the entire spend, and you got to start with analyzing the spend and categorizing the spend across multiple units to see where is the opportunity, and then you got to pick the opportunities that are going to give you the quick wins and the highest return, so that you gain credibility right away. And you got to make sure that you disposition what's going to happen to the savings, because if you save a lot of money and it doesn't show in the P&L, I can't tell you how many CFOs I've talked to that said, hey, this is not it's not really money. It's not really money when it is, but it just vaporizes and they can't find it.
Exactly. How do you manage stakeholders who refuse to participate in procurement management of Indirect?
So one of the things that I mentioned, and one of the things that we did, is we created the projects that we wanted to. We actually identified all the targets, and this was in a pharmaceutical company. We identified over $30 million in savings from Indirect. One of the teams, and I'll tell you another guy that's done it too. One of the teams was IT. They didn't want to play at all. So we gave them the target and gave them the process and said, you don't have to play with us, but you have to follow this process. You have to commit. You have to report back to the steering group, and you have to deliver this amount of savings. You don't have to use procurement, but you have to follow the process, and you have to do this. Well, after a period of time, they got tired of following the process and having to do all the extra steps that procurement people have to do in terms of contract management, managing the contract, doing the right process, managing supplier relationships. We gave them the process and said, this is what you have to follow. They got tired of doing it. Another guy which I work with, and I know you know, John, he actually left the difficult stakeholders to the backside. And I've done this too in projects where, okay, you don't have to play. And then as you're starting to get gains, the business puts more and more pressure on the stakeholder as long as you're making gains, and they want you to get into that spend. So you give them the process, say, here it is, or you leave them alone. Do your quick wins and start getting some credibility for what you do. And it won't take very long for the management to make a mandate on that. So everybody else is making progress. One of two things happen. Everybody else is making progress, and they're left in the backside. So they either want to jump on the train and be part of the initiative that's moving forward if you do it like an initiative, or they're going to be forced into the thing. So I wouldn't make a big deal about it. I just go on and find the projects that I can find where I'm going to have success.
Right. Okay, thank you. You also mentioned that the stakeholders should be responsible for the key supplier metrics. However, what role, if any, should procurement be involved after awarding the project? For example, business reviews. Should this be the procurement's responsibility or the stakeholder?
I think it's the stakeholder. I want to be, as a procurement person, I want to be involved, and I want to help the stakeholder architect what that review should look like. But it's really clear they own the budget, and they really have a stake in driving the performance of the supplier. We own the commercial relationship, and we own getting the contract right and optimizing the amount of dollars. So yeah, I did say that. I did say that the stakeholders should manage performance, but we should really help them architect what are the performance metrics they should be doing. And I think that we can as long as we know what's going on, we can enable stakeholders to do that. We can sit through the meetings, but remember that the ownership is in different places. That's my view, anyway. So I got one more. Go ahead, John. I'm going to take one more, and then I've got a couple more slides I want to go through.
Okay, great. If procurement owns the commercial side and the stakeholder owns the business relationship and the responsibility for metrics, what are the metrics that the stakeholder owns?
Well, I think the stakeholder owns the metrics for how well is the supplier performing. Are they getting the value that they want to get? You know, are they achieving what they need to do? You know, and then we have to have clear criteria that we work with the stakeholders on the beginning. On the beginning of the process, when we're actually going to do a strategy, we're going to identify the performance criteria before we ever go out and source, or before we even talk to their supplier. So we're going to identify, we're going to have a brainstorming session as a team to identify what are the key performance. Hello? John, you there?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Yep. What are the key performances that we're trying to drive the supplier to? What are the end results? Where do we want the supplier to be? And how are we going to architect what value is coming through?
Right, great. Well, Bill, as you mentioned, I think there's an event coming up for Zycus.
Yeah, there is. And it's an event that I've participated in the past, and I've encouraged people to see it. It's called Horizon. It's going to be on October 23rd through 25th. It's at the Ritz-Carlton in Dove Mountain in Arizona. And this event is really how procurement pay-to-pay, purchase-to-pay systems work, and really network with a bunch of leaders. So at some point, I'll be there, and I think it's a great event to go to, and I would encourage people to look into it and go to it.
Thank you, Bill. If anyone's interested in getting more information about today's presentation or speaking with Bill directly, his contact information is available, as well as the marketing team for Zycus. And Bill, thank you for an engaging presentation. Attendees of today's event will receive an email from ISM in the next 24 hours thanking them for attending this web seminar. This email will contain the link to your CEH certificate. And we appreciate your time and hope you found this webcast to be a valuable experience. We thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.